Egypt, land of countless treasures and riches, with its pyramids and tombs. Amidst all of these monuments, the ancient Egyptians left us mysterious inscriptions telling of their great history. Hieroglyphs. 200 years ago, a young French scholar, Jean-François Champollion, achieved the impossible. He deciphered these hieroglyphs, which had remained silent for more than a millennium. Thanks to his insights, an entire civilization buried in the desert sand was brought back to life. Today, science is increasingly interested in the men who wrote these hieroglyphs, a literate elite that worked for the pharaohs. They were priests, scribes, painters, engravers, and builders of tombs. In the south of Egypt, a palace filled with hieroglyphs intrigues Egyptologists. The largest tomb in the country, constructed for a very important figure in pharaonic society.
How is this man able to build this incredible monument?
We'll venture into the darkest depths and stifling heat of this labyrinth to reveal the latest secrets of hieroglyphs. We must leave the political capital of the empire, Memphis, today's Cairo, and make our way 700 kilometers upstream along the Nile to reach Thebes, today's Luxor. At the gates of the former religious capital, on the east bank of the river, stands the majestic Karnak temple complex. Constructed almost 4,000 years ago, it was, with Luxor, the greatest religious site in ancient Egypt, an architectural wonder dedicated to sacred rites. The stones are covered in strange and fascinating signs that the Greeks named hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, because for the Egyptians, these were the words of the gods.
Hieroglyphs are perhaps the writings that has been used for the longest time in the history of the world, because they were used for well over 3,000 years, only ending in the 5th century AD with the advent of Christianity, and that is after that the sacred writings of the ancient Egyptians could not survive. And these stones were mute. We had no idea what the ancient Egyptians were saying, what they were thinking, what their religion was about.
To understand the beliefs in the afterlife and the fears of the ancient Egyptians, we must cross the Nile to the West Bank and the realm of the dead. It was here that for centuries, on the steep mountainsides, pharaohs dug their sumptuous tombs. The Theban necropolis stretches far beyond the Valley of the Kings. These monuments are countless. Among them, the funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut and the burial places of other important dignitaries. Another is this remarkable tomb, the vastest and most enigmatic ever discovered in Egypt. Its dimensions are mind-boggling, but strangely, it's not the tomb of a pharaoh. Archaeologists have named it TT33 for Theban Tomb 33. A holy grail for the decipherers of hieroglyphs. For the past 17 years, Professor Claude Tronecker has been studying TT33 under the aegis of the French Institute of Oriental Archeology in Cairo. With him are Sylvia Einaudi and Isabelle Réjean, two Egyptologists and renowned epigraphists whose job is to copy, translate, and interpret the texts. Today is a big day. After 2 years with no excavations, the team is once again authorized to enter the tomb. On this campaign, they'll have only 4 weeks to exhume the latest treasures and safeguard the millennial texts carved into the walls. Constructed on a site measuring half a hectare, the tomb presents an exceptional surface area for all those who study hieroglyphs. Its complex layout and deep shafts have trapped more than one intrepid explorer since the 19th century.
Lots of people visited it as the region's great curiosity, with its legend of being a cursed and dangerous tomb. There were very large colonies of bats here. And when people came in, the bats would fly out, causing accidents. People only had candlelight, so a number of them fell down the shaft of room 12 when the wind from the bats' wings blew out their candles.
But who does this imposing and mysterious tomb belong to?
Here he is.
Padiamenope. Padiamenope.
Padiamenope.
In the first 2 passageways, there's always an image of Padiamenope looking towards the entrance to the tomb as if he were greeting visitors.
His name and image are all over the walls. There's no doubt about it, this is his final resting place. For almost 100 years, the visit of the tomb stopped at room 3, because early in the 20th century, renowned French archaeologist Gaston Maspero had built a wall to block the entrance to room 4.
There's a nice little article by Maspero that says, "We walled in Padiamenope's tomb because of the bats. I hope that when it's reopened, we'll finally find out who Padiamenope was." And I made use of this text to have the tomb opened again.
In December 2005, when Claude Tronecker obtained authorization to break down the wall to access the rest of the tomb, he entered a space that had been closed for a century. The decomposed bodies of millions of bats had saturated the air with ammoniac, making it unbreathable. The state of the floor and walls had badly degraded, but when the professor looked more closely at the walls, he realized he'd discovered a priceless treasure.
It was a revelation, especially this word of greeting that I discovered. I remember when I saw it, I had tears in my eyes. An appeal to the living. Oh, you who are on earth, those who are born, this marks the future. Mes tu, and those who will be born. It's quite incredible. And it interestingly goes on to address those who come to stroll. Coming to the necropolis for a stroll. Not bad. Those who come to have fun looking at ancient tombs. This dates from the 7th century BCE, so there had already been 2,000 years of tombs before then. Or those who come looking for spells. That's us, that's us. When I read that, I must admit, I was moved to tears. Those looking for spells. And he goes on. May they observe what is in this tomb. And then there's a blessing. They will receive the blessing of the god Amun if they respect this tomb. And finally, he asks us to repair whatever is damaged. It's a very daring, direct message.
A message from the depths of time. Padiamenope addresses us directly, asking us to keep his tomb in good repair. A visionary or a megalomaniac? How could he have such a concept of his own posterity? Isabel and Sylvia have been investigating for more than 10 years, studying the walls and wandering the maze of corridors that leads to the burial chamber. The ultimate aim of their quest is to find answers to the many enigmas that still surround the figure of Padiamenope. They have already established that the architectural style of the tomb places its construction at around 700 BCE. To go further, they must capture 3D images of the entire site, 360 degrees around.
A little bit lower. That's it. We're good. I started here at room 4. We're here in room 5. And I'll keep making the topographic survey of the tomb until the last room.
Isabel, Sylvia, and their photo crew are photographing the walls, ceiling, and ground of each room to model the monument in 3 dimensions and thus create the very first complete virtual visit of Padiamenope's tomb.
We're about to start the photogrammetry phase, where we'll align the images and a cloud of dots. The images will be aligned by the photogrammetry software. It involves the recognition of counterpart pixels between each image. Then we go on to the second phase, which is meshing. Here, the software picks up the millions of dots and joins them all together with little triangles. And that gives the volume to the model. So we're really moving from 2D to 3D. Once we've composed the model, we go on to the last step, compositing.
We'll decide on the camera movement and then the lighting and lighting moods. And finally, the rendering of the tomb itself. Here, the camera is on the outside, and it allows us to see the exterior volumes of the tomb with all its architecture and depth. In the other scenario, we're on a virtual visit, with the camera inside the tomb. Here we're in room 1, as it is today, in a degraded state. These 2 camera features are quite complementary because they'll allow us to work out how we're going to work in the tomb.
An extraordinary premiere of a virtual exploration. For the first time, we can observe the vast maze that makes up TT33. 22 rooms, countless corridors, and inextricable galleries. All spread across 3 levels, buried more than 20 meters beneath the desert sands. 2,622 square meters of decorated walls, every single one of them covered in hieroglyphs. But how will our archaeologists decipher these carvings ravaged by the centuries, by earthquakes, damaged by pillagers, and the black smoke of their oil lamps? Only the deciphering of the writings on the walls will teach us more about the owner of this tomb. We know his name, but what kind of power did he hold to construct a resting place even vaster and grander than that of a pharaoh?
Here we see his name, Padiamenope, with the determinative, which tells us it's a man, and his main title, Rerireb, and Reritep, which mean lector priest and chief, or lector priest and master of ceremonies. Padiamenope must have been someone who knew ancient Egypt's religious history very well, along with the religious texts. He's mentioned here as being a royal scribe.
He was the intermediary between, let's say, those who worked in the library, who devised the rites, who thought, who catalogued the papyri, before going out before the crowd to conduct religious ceremonies. You could say he was the link between religious theory and religious practice. And with what aim? To appease the Egyptian people, because the Egyptians were so fearful. You didn't build things like this without having a fear of death.
A statue of Padiamenope in the Cairo Museum portrays him as a scribe, thus belonging to the literate elite, which held a huge power over the rest of the population who couldn't read or write. We can see the most famous member of this privileged caste, the guardians of sacred knowledge at the Louvre Museum in Paris, in the shape of the seated scribe, a masterpiece of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities. Christophe Barbotin is a renowned hieroglyphic specialist.
Egypt was governed by a literate elite, which we call scribes, because they knew how to write. This ability to write distinguished them from others. This literate elite oversaw a vast number of farmers, because the Egyptian civilization was both agricultural and administrative, a strange mix. But that's how things were for 3,000 years. The scribes' main job was to keep the accounts and write letters, basically administrative tasks. The more cultured among them wrote literature, because there was an Egyptian literature in the modern sense of the term, while others ran libraries. Scribes wrote with a reed, the end of which was gnawed at to make it a bit like a brush, which was dipped in black or red ink. The black was made of coke with a binder. The red was ochre, which was found in the earth, and that's how they worked, with different reed brushes, depending on whether they were writing or painting. Basically, hieroglyphs read from right to left. To understand which way to read them, you simply take a pictorial hieroglyph, for example, a quail chick. It's looking to the left, which means you read from left to right, and downwards in a column. In another inscription, it could be the opposite. For example, around a door or niche, there might be, on the left-hand side of the door, signs that show right to left, or vice versa. It's monumental writing which goes very well with architecture.
Back to the Palace of Hieroglyphs. Sylvia Einaudi and Isabelle Réjean are putting all their epigraphic talents to the test to try to interpret the messages that Padiamenope left for future visitors. All the keys to understanding are there, carved in stone before their eyes.
Epigraphy involves copying inscriptions to study them afterwards. The parts seen here in grey, with the pencil marks, are places with gaps, which I can't see on the wall despite my best efforts with my flashlight. Because salt crystals have formed and damaged the inscriptions, or where parts of the wall have simply collapsed. I'm using a low-angled light to see if a mark I can see on the wall is really a hieroglyph, or if it's a crack in the wall.
Sylvia has a very limited time in the tomb, but her high-definition photos will enable her to keep working on the deciphering once back in the lab.
We'll take about 500 pictures of this wall. We use low-angled light and high definition, which allows us to zoom in on the inscriptions and collect a maximum amount of information.
The two systems are complementary, but it's crucial to have what I call a physical approach with the inscriptions, to try to read them with the movement of the light and shade, to pick out the tiny details that are illegible even with the high-definition photos, especially with walls as damaged as these. And while copying the text, you have time to start thinking about and start translating the text you're in the act of copying.
Because linguistic skills aren't enough, To fully grasp this writing, you need to know its history, where it came from, when it emerged. It first appeared around 3200 BCE. It was used for almost 3,500 years and gradually disappeared once the Roman Empire took political and religious control of ancient Egypt. To understand why the use of hieroglyphs died out, we must return to the end of the 4th century of our era, when the Roman Empire, which stretched as far as Egypt, fully adopted Christianity. In the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree effectively dissolving all pagan worship. Egypt lost its literate elite, which had mastered the knowledge of hieroglyphs. The 3,000-year-old form of writing fell into a deep sleep of 1,400 years. But everything changed at the dawn of the 19th century. In 1798, General Bonaparte landed in Egypt. His military campaign doubled up as a scientific expedition, the aim of which was to study the history and geography of the country. It's in Cairo that one of the original copies of the account of the expedition is conserved. Description of Egypt. In this gigantic work, Egyptologists discovered one of the rare representations of Padiamenope's tomb, then called the Great Syringe. Intrigued by this labyrinth, Bonaparte's scholars explored and drafted the very precise plans of the tomb. But they were unable of understanding the hieroglyphs on its walls. But it was on this expedition that a soldier made the big discovery which would pave the way for deciphering hieroglyphs in the north of the country, in the small town of Rosetta. Lieutenant Bouchard found a stele dating from the 2nd century BCE, carved with a decree by the king Ptolemy V. The text was in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, Egyptian demotic, a simplified cursive version of hieroglyphs, and ancient Greek.
Here's a copy of the plate of the Rosetta stone from Description of Egypt. They immediately realized the extreme importance of this trilingual stone. In the hieroglyphics, there's the cartouche of Ptolemy V, which served as a reference and allowed them to understand that the cartouches contained royal names. And there's the Greek version at the bottom of the stone, which enabled term-by-term comparisons between Greek and Egyptian expressions. So these inscriptions allowed scholars to establish a large number of equivalents and served as the foundation for research into the deciphering of hieroglyphs.
Before we could read hieroglyphs, looking at these monuments was a mystery, and that's why there's so much esoterica that this has generated, with people thinking that these are all symbols, that they don't have sound values. So you could look at these monuments and not really understand things until Champollion came and unlocked this key, this mystery. You can see this cartouche, which is this oval thing which held the name of the king. And here you can see Ptolemy. So this is the name of Ptolemy. And of course, this is one of the crucial names that we have in Egyptology, not because of his importance, but because his name was on the Rosetta Stone. And this was the first name to be deciphered.
But how was Champollion able to decipher this dead language from a few signs carved on a stone? Step 1. We know he was a scholar of ancient Greek, so he could read the name of Ptolemy, Ptolemaeus in Greek, on the Rosetta Stone. and then identify the cartouche of the same Ptolemy written in hieroglyphs. That allowed him to write the 7 letters P, T, O, L, M, Y, S, opposite the 7 hieroglyphs. Once he could decipher in the same way the cartouche of Queen Cleopatra, he isolated the 3 hieroglyphs L, O, P, already identified in the Ptolemys cartouche. And he completed the word with the missing letters K, E, A, T, R, A, opposite the 6, as yet unidentified hieroglyphs. Step 2. The cartouches contained the phonetic transcriptions of Greek names. But what could he do with the names of the pharaohs that ruled before Greek colonization? And that's where Champollion's genius came into play. The young scholar was a language enthusiast. Aged just 13, he studied Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Aramaic. He soon developed an intuition that he would need to study Coptic to understand the language of the ancient Egyptian. But why Coptic?
At the beginning of our era, the Egyptians abandoned the hieroglyphic system and transcribed their language using the Greek alphabet. That's what we call Coptic. Coptic language and writing would then endure in the liturgical texts of Coptic Orthodox Christians. In the 19th century, Champollion could read and write Coptic, and he relied on this continuity between the language transcribed by hieroglyphs and Coptic texts to unlock the secret of hieroglyphs.
So it was thanks to Coptic that Champollion would translate a new cartouche. A new cartouche in which he recognized the S. And the first hieroglyph of the name seemed to be a sun, which in Coptic is pronounced Ra. He was just missing the hieroglyph in the middle. Could it be Ramses? The greatest of the pharaohs, whose name was remembered despite the disappearance of hieroglyphs. Champollion immediately turned to another cartouche, the first sign of which was an ibis, which symbolizes the god Tot. So, if his Ramses hypothesis was correct, the second sign was perhaps an M, and the last sign he knew, the S. So, Tot M says. Of course, Thutmose, another famous pharaoh mentioned in Greek texts. There was no longer any doubt. The young French scholar could read hieroglyphs, because beyond proper nouns, he even deduced the very nature of the Egyptian language, explaining it thus. It's an extremely complex system, a writing that is at the same time figurative, symbolic, and phonetic, within a single text, a single sentence. A whole new world opened up to him. After 10 years of research, trial and error, and wild goose chases, Champollion had finally managed to crack the hieroglyphic code. Years later, the heirs of the French genius continue his deciphering work. They decided to make Padiamenope's tomb a showpiece of ancient Egypt because of the importance of the writings on the walls, for they constitute the main funerary texts, collections of spells to help the deceased in the afterlife. So the tomb is much more than a resting place. Padiamenope turned it into an extraordinary library, unique in Egypt. By assembling this compendium of ancient Egyptian sacred texts, he became a genuine encyclopedist. Studying these texts tells us how the ancient Egyptians viewed the world, for they tell the great myths of this civilization. Let's discover that of the sun god Ra, who, every night, fought off evil creatures who wanted to keep him a prisoner of the night. For this campaign, Isabelle Régent has set herself the task of deciphering the rest of the text.
Voici la première heure du livre de l'âme droite.
Here is the first hour of the Book of Amduat. The sun has just set. It's gone into the depths of the earth. In his night boat with Youth, the nocturnal form of the sun with his ram's head. And before him, kneeling in adoration, is Padiamenope, whose title and name are indicated here. The sun god's night boat has an entire crew to help him safely reach the hour when he'll rise at the end of the night. With several deities, we can see three outlines here. To the fore of the boat are four haulers. They'll haul the boat through the places where it's difficult to sail.
What on earth is Padiamenope doing in the sun god's night boat? As a worshipper of Ra, why does he want to defend him?
As the hours go by, there are various events. Padiamenope is actively involved, hauling the sun god's boat, harpooning Apophis, the serpent that tries to stop the boat from progressing. He's very actively involved in the journey and even performs a ritual dance for the sun god.
If, during the 12 hours of night, Padiamenope is unable to bring the sun god's boat home safely, the sun will not rise, and it will be the end of the world. And so, every morning, when the sun reappears, all living beings bow down before the sun god to celebrate his victory, that of life versus death.
Padiamenope's version is very original. Into the sacred text, he inserts his own name and title. So there's the presence of the man of letters, but also the desire to promote himself.
According to a tradition dating back to the Old Kingdom, it's usually the pharaoh who's seen in the boat, kneeling before the Ra. So why has Padiamenope taken the pharaoh's place? Pride or devotion? Isabelle Régent's work provides the answer. He replaces the king as defender of Ra to make sure that after his death, he will rise every day with the sun, a way of guaranteeing eternal life in the land of the dead. But ensuring the protection of the sun god isn't enough. He must also earn the favor of Osiris, the god of the dead.
We're in room 9 of the tomb, which has 2 walls dedicated to the famous weighing of the heart. Padiamenope is addressing the 42 deities, the assessors of Osiris, who helped the god to judge the deceased on arriving in the afterlife. So here's the name, Padiamenope, then the negative. Does not have a list of bad deeds. He says he hasn't killed anybody, robbed anybody, he has never lied, has never given in to corruption, etc., etc., 42 times.
Once again, Padiamenope is central to the action. This time in the weighing of the heart scene, the most famous part of the Book of the Dead. Having placed a feather on one side of the scale, Anubis, the god of death and master of necropolises, places the deceased's heart on the other side. For the deceased to continue living in the afterlife, his heart must be as light as the feather, proof that he has committed no evil deeds. Tot, the god of wisdom and writing, notes the result of the weighing on his tablet. At his feet is Ammit, the devourer of the dead, a monstrous deity who eats the heart of the deceased if it is not judged pure, meaning without evil deeds. In such a case, the deceased cannot continue living in the afterlife. The whole scene takes place before Osiris, god of the dead and president of this divine tribunal. He will decide whether the deceased is pure or if he dies forever. Why does Padiamenope show such devotion to Osiris? Was he trying to win the god's favor? But that's not all. Egyptologists have found dozens of carvings of his name on the walls of his tomb. But why? For him and his contemporaries, hieroglyphs had a magic power. As long as visitors of the tomb continued to utter his name, he would be assured of living in the afterlife.
For the ancient Egyptians, the word was incredibly powerful. Words are magical. If you write something down, it has power. And once you say it, it gives it even more power. It ritualizes the whole thing. And so it's the same way that in any magic, even today, no matter where you are, if you give someone a name, they have power over you. So words have power. And one of the creation myths of the ancient Egyptians was the god would think, and then he would speak, and it would come into being. And this is not so different from the monotheistic religions that today, this idea of the power of the word.
I know the secret of hieroglyphs. All kinds of magic I have acquired. None of it escapes me. So here is a craftsman, and it's very rare for a craftsman to be associated with the high mastery of hieroglyphs who has access to the powers of magic. And not only does he master magic, what's more, he proves it on the stele with a very interesting process that has remained unnoticed until now. If we look at the bottom of the stele, there are bringers of offerings, bringing food to the deceased couple, which is the usual scene. But if you look at the offering bearer's feet, you see that they have been hammered as if to magically attach them to the stele, because within the hieroglyphic principle, these images are hieroglyphs themselves, which could potentially leave the monument and bring an end to the service. In this way, and through the magic he possesses, he keeps the figures attached to the stele.
Hieroglyphs only acquire magic powers once they're carved in stone. Same for the deceased, who can only continue living in the afterlife if their body is embalmed and resting in their tomb.
When Padiamenope decided to build this tomb, he had it dug deep in the Torah limestone. He started with a deep courtyard, dug right into the limestone, and as the construction progressed, craftsmen began sculpting the walls, which are as white as cathedral stone.
To dig and decorate a tomb of such a size must have taken a good 20 years, if not more, and certainly in terrible conditions. We know there were several crews working on the tombs at the same time. When the excavators were working in the deepest sections, scribes and craftsmen had already begun decorating the first rooms, which were finished. That's how the work progressed, but it still took 20 to 40 years.
Who were these builders and craftsmen who dug and decorated tombs? To find out, we must go back 8 centuries before Padiamenope to a unique archaeological site in Egypt, about a kilometer from TT33. The village for the craftsmen who worked on royal tombs, or a hieroglyphic school.
Here we are at Deir el-Medina, which is one of the most important places in Egypt. It's the workman's village, and these are the people who decorated the tombs of the kings in the Valley of the Queens. And here, this is in the west bank of Thebes, where the Valley of the Queens, which they also decorated, is there. The Valley of the Kings is just over there. And also the nobles' tombs and the temples are very close by. And so for several hundred years, people lived here. And what is so remarkable about it is not only that we have the village, the tombs, and the places where they worshipped, but we also have a lot of texts that tell us about these people. So you can recognize individuals. So this is where Egypt comes alive.
The village was built at the time of Thutmose I, more than 3,500 years ago. The workmen would leave the village at the beginning of each week to dig, construct, and decorate the tombs of the pharaohs. It's one of the sites where we found the most objects. At the end of the New Kingdom, the site was abandoned and became buried in the sand, and the objects left behind by the inhabitants were discovered on digs in the early 20th century.
As part of a mission led by the Institute, Cédric Larcher oversees and coordinates researchers from around the world who gather at the site for 2 months every year. Their aim is to study the remains found in the village to better understand the work of these unsung craftsmen.
This is our place of work, our laboratory where the mission's researchers work on objects found directly on the ground. Gersonde is analyzing the different types of wood found on the site. Zachary and Ahmed are scanning our database to find out what this object was used for, what's written on it, and to establish the context of where it was found on the site. This is an ostracon. These ostraca have been found in large quantities at Deir el-Medina. They're fragments of limestone or potsherds which were used as writing tablets by the inhabitants there. The ostraca give us a lot of information about everyday local life, as they mention events or consist of lists of workers and their families. But some of them were used to practice writing, which shows that people undertook apprenticeships in writing here at Deir el-Medina. Here we can see a red line was painted as a guide for the carving, but you can see that the hand wasn't very assured, whereas this was done by someone at a more advanced stage because the signs are sharp and render the basket very well.
Here in Deir el-Medina, you can see different degrees of specialization. And that's, of course, because people were always learning the craft. So their fathers would be teaching their children, but probably also the priest would help in terms of the reading and the writing. But you can see with the ostracon where people are clumsily writing out their hieroglyphs like their baby ABCs, and then they get very confident.
They copied out classic texts again and again until not only did they know them by heart, but they could also write all the signs. We imagine that the apprentice had models, and he had to keep carving the same sign until he could reproduce the volume expected by the teacher. Here there are columns of very well-written little signs, all of them well-spaced. It's a very good piece of copying work.
For the letters to each other, you would use hieratic, which is basically hieroglyphs, but a more relaxed form. So it is the same way that hieroglyphs are like capital letters, very formal, and hieratic is joined up cursive writing.
While Egypt was 99% illiterate, the craftsmen's community of Deir el-Medina was essentially inhabited by literate people. It was organized according to a strict social hierarchy so as to spread work evenly among the tombs.
Among the important ostraca found on the site is one now kept at the British Museum, which contains information about the organisation of work at the royal tombs. Here, written in hieratic, are the names of the workers, with a list of the days they were present or absent. Scribes kept daily registers. They took a roll call to see who was there and who wasn't. We have some of the excuses presented by the absent. So-and-so absent for a family funeral, and so on. And along with the lists of workers are the names of the chief builders who oversaw their work at the tombs.
These chief builders, whom we now call architects, coordinated both the construction of the tombs and their decoration with hieroglyphs. And the work was meticulously planned. First, the excavators dug into a limestone vein in the mountain, which had been carefully located beforehand. It was grueling work. The men only had wooden mallets and bronze chisels to excavate the rock. Steel tools didn't exist in the ancient Egypt of 3,500 years ago. Others then evacuated the rubble from inside the tomb. Next came the polishers to smooth the floors and walls. Then others would trace grids on the walls. These were the framework for the outline scribes, who used red ink to sketch figurative scenes and texts which would later be carved. Next on the scene were the sculptors, who carved the stone with wooden mallets and fine copper chisels, following the previously sketched guide. And the final link in the chain, the painters, who colored the carved scenes and hieroglyphs.
We found a large number of paintbrushes of varying shapes and sizes, depending on their use. Some brushes were used for applying stucco or painting the first layer on the walls to be decorated. Finer brushes were used to paint the figures or hieroglyphs. The brushes are mainly vegetable fibers, folded over and bound with cord. There's a vast amount of pottery, pots for inks and paints. This one was used for red ink. This blue was obtained by grinding the mineral, which was then refined with a buffer. There are still traces of the blue pigment here, which was used to make the paint paste.
At Deir el-Medina, there is an exceptionally well-conserved temple which illustrates the pictorial skills of these craftsmen of antiquity. The Temple of Hathor, constructed around 200 BCE, which contains beautiful representations of the gods Amun and Osiris. The crazy challenge that Elizabeth Bettles has set herself is to attach a name to each artist. With the determination of a detective, this British paleography expert works tirelessly to try to identify the painter of this tomb, belonging to a scribe of the 19th dynasty.
Everybody's handwriting is different. Everybody's handwriting is unique. Today, as it is known that that is the case, and it would have been exactly the same in over 3,000 years ago as this was. All of this learning about the man who created these hieroglyphs, who painted them, I've got to get to know him. So I've got to try and find his handwriting style through the shape, through of the sign, through how he created the sign, how he spelt things. And at the moment, I'm concentrating on doing individual hieroglyphs to find out what their shape is. I take a close-up photograph, and from that, I then draw digitally, I draw on my laptop the outlines of each brushstroke. Then I go
to study the sequence of the brush strokes, which ones were on top of the other. My long-term goal is to create a kind of an interactive database to be able to show people who we can name, who we know who they married, what their children's names were. So we can learn so much about the people who were literate, who could write.
You can recognize now the hands of the painters because they each has a special technique, which is marvelous because, again, you start to connect the finished work of art with the individual.
The last artists left Deir el-Medina 8 centuries before the construction of Padiamenope's tomb. And yet, their techniques and know-how were passed down from generation to generation until those who decorated TT33. The mission goes on. The Egyptologists have decided to reconstruct, like a vast jigsaw puzzle, the magnificent decoration which time has broken into thousands of pieces. To help them, they have called on archaeologist Simone Nanucci. This morning, while digging in the tomb's first rooms, he discovered further information about Padiamenope.
While digging, we found thousands of fragments from the walls, pillars, and ceiling. The aim of our research is to place them in their original position.
This part probably came from the southern wall of the room, where we can see Padiamenope's mummy before his tomb, and here, part of his title, Rerireb, or Reritep, lector priest and master of ceremonies. And here's the beginning of the name, Padi, so Padiamenope must have been written here.
Look at the detail in the ears and nostrils.
Vestili.
I hadn't noticed that. So it's a representation of the tomb we're in right now.
Right, in its ideal state.
Padiamenope must be very happy in the afterlife. We never stop mentioning his name. This is so moving.
This is a fragment of the face of one of Padiamenope's funerary statuettes, known as an ushapti. We recognize it as it's from a series that we already know, as we've found other fragments. Ushaptis were placed in the tomb with the deceased.
The tomb's original floor is about 50 centimeters below the surface we've been walking on since starting working here. Here are the 50 centimeters or so we've cleared in this part of the room. You can see traces of ash and other layers of debris. These rooms were almost certainly used by people who lived nearby as temporary accommodation and as stables for their animals.
While in Padiamenope's tomb, the vast decorations of the walls and ceiling take shape in the Egyptologist's eyes, over in Deir el-Medina, Cédric Larcher continues his own work to extract a maximum amount of information from the fragments of pottery found on the site.
We have some objects on which we can just make out some lines of writing without being able to see what they are. To bring out the image, which is currently invisible, Our restorer cleans the surface to get rid of all the dust and dirt. Then we take photos here on the site and send them to our lab where our image treatment expert tries to determine what's on the ostracon. The photo is now on the computer. We give it a digital treatment, playing with the object's different colors and with the light by using different filters to enhance what we can't see with the naked eye. On this piece, we have a fine representation of the god Ptah, an important god because he was particularly worshipped here near Deir el-Medina. And then once we've brought out the image, we do a drawing on a graphic tablet so we can publish it. Caro is a graphic artist. Her job is to make visible what has become invisible to the naked eye, because a wall may have collapsed or the paint faded. With the drawing she produces, we can see more clearly what was painted on the walls. Okay, remove the photo. If we zoom in on spaces, for example, we can see the picture more clearly. The advantage of this technique, once we've removed the photo, is being able to join the lines together to get an idea of what the scenes must have looked like, notably by comparing them to similar scenes found in other tombs.
The carved walls of temples and tombs aren't the only source available to archaeologists for documenting the history of this civilization. 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians invented another writing medium from the stalk of a plant that grows along the banks of the Nile, papyrus. In the 19th century, Egyptian papyri became collector's items. A man called Bernardino Drovetti, France's consul in Cairo, made a business out of it. The king of Piedmont paid him a fortune to put together a collection for him. An archaeological treasure made up of statues, objects, and papyri so impressive that in 1824, the king was able to open a museum. And barely inaugurated, the curators had only one thing on their mind.
When the Drovetti collection was acquired, they hope to bring the man who had found the key to ancient Egypt to Turin. So Champollion accepts their invitation. He is not at all happy about the fact that France has not acquired the collection, but Turin has. And so he's credited with that famous saying that the road to Memphis and Thebes goes through Turin.
But in Turin, Champollion had found paradise. He stayed at the museum for 8 months, studying papyri, which he described to his brother as beyond eulogy. He made extraordinary discoveries while restoring the microscopic fragments brought back from Egypt by Bernardino Drovetti. Today in Turin, we can see the same dedication shown by Champollion in the gestures of the scientists restoring and recomposing papyri. It was in these very workshops that 200 years ago, Champollion completed a work that would lay the foundations for determining the chronology of the Pharaonic dynasties.
Chronology is one of the primary concern of Champollion when he arrives in Turin. Champollion is confronted with a rich collection such as he has never seen before. Among the fragmentary papyrus that Champollion was confronted with was one that was a list of royal names. The Turin Canon, or the Papyrus of Kings, a list of kings starting from the time of the gods and all the way into historical times and until, presumably, the time of Ramses II, under whom this list was compiled. The duration of their reigns are preserved: 8 years for Menkaure, 22 for Djedkare, and 30 for Wenis. It is one of the fundamental historical documents of Egyptology. It is the only real king list or objective king list that we have.
In the museum's reserves, Champollion was excited to discover other papyri. One of them in particular seized his attention. A text written during the reign of Ramses III, which tells the story of the first known strike in the history of mankind.
The strike papyrus, it's the account of the workmen of Deir el-Medina not receiving their salary, meaning their food, in order to perform their job. They get out of the site of Deir el-Medina to reach the Ramesseum in order to complain, like, we want our salary. And then they say, as long as we won't receive it, we will not work. We put down our wooden mallet and our copper chisel. We are not working. And if the king doesn't have a tomb, well, actually, this is the end of the world, because the king is the support of the balance of the world between evil and right, evil and good. So the king is ensuring the continuity of the world, the fact that the sun will rise again every day. So in order for him to do that, even when he's dead, he needs a tomb in order to survive in the afterlife. So the work they were doing is very important for the balance of the cosmic order. With this papyrus, this is the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. This is the beginning of the end, the cracks in the system, and this is what this papyrus is telling us.
Champollion deciphered the Turin papyri with relish, but he still dreamed of embarking on the big adventure of his life: to sail up the Nile and deep into Nubia to perfect his deciphering system by studying hieroglyphs directly on the monuments. This dream, which had pursued him through his teenage years, he had formulated while observing certain plates in Description of Egypt, notably this one on the Temple of Hathor at Deir el-Medina.
It's a magnificent depiction with a very special mood, reinforced by the priest in contemplation before the carvings. This gave Champollion a first, fairly faithful image of an Egyptian temple, with its pictures and writings. But he soon realized he would need to correct the inscriptions himself, on site, to have reliable readings.
It would take him 2 years to make his dream come true, to mount an expedition made up of 14 scholars and scientists to explore, on an epic journey of 18 months, the main sites of antiquity previously visited by the Bonaparte expedition. It was a colossal challenge, but Champollion was equal to the task. The moment he arrived in Egypt in 1828, Champollion was transformed. He was nicknamed the Egyptian. He grew a beard, carried a sword, and wore Turkish clothes. He wanted to see everything and make the most methodical and meticulous drawings and plans possible. Keen to share his wonder at such beauty with his compatriots, he returned to France with priceless treasures, sarcophagi and statuettes discovered in the tombs he visited. During his stay in Thebes, he went to Deir el-Medina to compare his childhood dream with the reality of the miraculously well-preserved ruins of the Temple of Hathor. The results of Champollion's great expedition would be published after his death in the monuments of Egypt and Nubia.
This is a drawing of the obelisk of Luxor, which was later transported to Paris after Champollion's death. It was erected on the Place de la Concorde in 1836. It was Champollion himself who was behind the obelisks of Luxor coming to Paris, rather than those of Alexandria, as had originally been planned.
This is a very famous obelisk because it is one of a pair. The other one is in Paris, because he came to Egypt to study the monuments that were left here and also to correct things that he had seen in the Description de l'Égypte as well as in other publications. So what he did was he would bring plates from books that had published things like this obelisk, and then he would look at the actual monument and the copy and look at it and check it and make corrections so that he had a true idea of what the ancient Egyptians were saying, and he could use this to further his study and knowledge of hieroglyphs.
Champollion is the father of Egyptology, not just because he deciphered hieroglyphs, but also because of his contribution to every field that constitutes the science. His work on Egyptian religion, his work on the Turin royal canon, and the lists of the pharaohs, and so on.
By recomposing and deciphering the Turin royal canon, Champollion gave us the historical timeline of the first pharaonic empires. But this list stopped at Ramses II. His successors completed the timeline until the Roman period. This was how Professor Tronecker was able to place the construction of TT33 around the 7th century BCE. But to complete the portrait of Padiamenope, he now needs to establish for certain under whose reign he served.
How come a man of such importance never speaks of his king in his tomb? From time to time he says, "I was an important man. The king of my day counted a lot on me," but he never names him.
So which king was it? It was by studying the tomb next to Padiamenope's, TT34, that of Mentuamat, governor of Upper Egypt and mayor of Thebes in the 7th century BCE, that gave Professor Tronecker the answer to this question.
Genuine power was held for about 10 years by Mentuamat, the man who built the great pylon, which you can see behind me. How does Padiamenope fit in here? I think they were just about contemporaries. Or there's perhaps 10 years between them. Because there are the same features found in Mentuamat's tomb as that of Padiamenope. So I believe that Padiamenope was a religious advisor to King Taharka.
Taharka. In the Louvre, we can admire the depiction of the most famous king of the 25th dynasty. The dynasty of the Black Pharaohs of the Kingdom of Kush. The Kushite kings.
The Nubian dynasty was already impregnated with Egyptian culture when it was established because they came from Sudan, Upper Nubia, which had been colonized by Egypt and had gone through a long acculturation process. So the Nubian elite was well adapted to the customs and religion of the Egyptians. They were more royalist than the king, so to speak, because they advocated a return to original purity.
Black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty who ruled Egypt in the 8th century BC came to take control and to show that they were controlling Egypt, but also that they were linking themselves with the great pharaonic past. They built here. Although these columns are very destroyed, we still have images of the king as well as his name, so we know who made this.
The name of King Taharka is written in this cartouche, carved on this column. It was he who constructed this vast architectural ensemble that opens onto the temple to the god Amun.
Padiamenope participated in this antiquity revival movement, which was very fashionable at the time. He illustrated inside his tomb with texts on the pyramids and on sarcophagi, which hadn't been in use for almost 2,000 years, to show how erudite he was to visitors. Because part of his tomb was meant to attract intellectual tourists, and Padiamenope was a secretary to the king at a certain time, at least.
The king's secretary? That would mean that Padiamenope led the ceremonies and took the place of the pharaoh during his absences. This strange ramp descending to the Nile is proof. It was constructed during Taharka's reign. Under the supervision of Padiamenope, this discovery is based on a text that Professor Troniker is deciphering in his tomb.
I constructed a mooring space, which means a quayside. This tells us he was in charge of construction work in Karnak. But as lector priest, he was also in charge of the ceremonies in Karnak. He calls himself he who conducted celebrations and ceremonies in the temple of Karnak. So he was a very, very important figure in terms of local worship.
And the grand finale of these ceremonies was a huge annual procession, which the ancient Egyptians called the Beautiful Festival of the Valley. It began on the famous ramp down to the Nile, the departure point for the sacred bark of Amun-Ra, who would make a long journey on the other bank of the river, touring the necropolises. This is why Padiamenope chose to build his own tomb in a place where the procession would stop off each year. At the Temple of Luxor, an entire wall is dedicated to a similar festival, the Beautiful Festival of Opé. It illustrates the exceptional scale of these processions.
This was a huge procession with priests, with animals for sacrifice being brought here, with notables. They were princes of Egypt, as well as princesses, lots of priests, and of course, the population gathered around the banks and also the processional way in order to see the bark of Amun being brought by all of the priests. There were a huge amount of offerings that were brought for the god, and these were then given to all the people who were attending the festival. And you can see here the bark of the god at rest in a bark shrine, because of course it's quite heavy to carry this. Offerings would be made, people would pray, and sometimes this is the only chance that the populace had to interact with the god directly. Even though the god is sort of in this boat and covered over, you knew that Amun was here. Then they would take the bark, and also part, of course, was in the Nile. There'd be singers and dancers the whole way, chanting the praises of the gods. And here you can see some of the musicians. There is a man with a drum, and also there would be dancers who were doing stick dancing, soldiers with their shields, and you continue seeing the musicians, and over here you can see these dancers who are doing backbends with their head. Probably people also came from the surrounding areas to be part of this extravagant event. Padiamenope was very key to this whole connection and this control system that the Nubian pharaohs had. So Taharka depended on Padiamenope to, in fact, guide him almost through the idea of Egypt's religion and the text.
Egyptologists have noted that many chapels built inside the Karnak complex and dedicated to the god Osiris date from the period of the Nubian pharaohs. It's hard to assess the exact influence of Padiamenope on the revival of Osiris worship, but for Selima Ikram, it's undeniable that the architecture of the chapels was a source of inspiration for Padiamenope.
This here is the 7 doorways of Osiris that lead you to the afterworld. This would have been a sort of core place for inspiration for the priest Padiamenope, whose tomb is an extraordinary tribute to the god Osiris.
The Egyptians were obsessed with continuing to live in the afterlife. Was that why Padiamenope dedicated his tomb to the worship of Osiris? What was he expecting from the god of the dead? A closer look at the architecture of his tomb brings a few answers. Padiamenope structured it in several distinct sections. The first was undoubtedly open to all visitors. whereas the second section was reserved solely for pilgrim worshippers of the god Osiris.
Imagine that we are not regular tomb tourists, but pilgrims come to worship at the altar of Osiris. We turn right. To access here, you need a special key. I even wonder whether there was an entrance fee.
Padiamenope certainly had his head screwed on. It's possible that he built himself a tomb that could make money.
Once through this door, we reach the cenotaph room. What's a cenotaph? A pretend tomb. It looks like a tomb, with all the decoration of the time, but there's no body inside. So what did the pilgrims do once they were here? They walked around, singing canticles. I think they would sing the texts inscribed at the tops of the walls. Imagine these people coming here as pilgrims, doing the tour like we are, following Padiamenope's route, and making offerings to Osiris. But they're also here to learn. The tomb is a kind of encyclopedia of local liturgy.
So the cenotaph was a pilgrimage destination for worshippers of Osiris, but not only. It was also here that the embalmers carried out their symbolic tasks. In these three chapels, where they replayed the ritual of preparing the deceased's body for the journey into the afterlife.
On the back of the doors in each of the chapels is a long text of 5 or 6 columns, in which Padiamenope gives quite a lot of information about who he is and what he does. So he's present, but not as the deceased, rather as an officiating priest for the benefit of the pilgrims. We're now in the first embalming room, where the body was dried. At the other end of the passageway is the chapel where they bound the body. And in the middle is where they equipped the mummy with amulets and other sacred objects, making up a package with the embalmed body so that a being could be reborn.
Reborn, opening the eyes. Once the mummy was finished by the embalmers, the priest would proceed with a final ritual, the opening of the mouth. Using a tool called an adze, the embalmer touched the mummy's mouth, nose, ears, and eyes so that the deceased could breathe, eat, and drink, basically carrying on living in the afterlife. Here, everything is symbolic. While the cenotaph is a pretend tomb of Osiris, the three chapels are also a symbolic representation of an embalming workshop. It was thus in this purely allegoric setting that Padiamenope officiated the ceremonies linked to the worship of the god of the dead. It's an intriguing fact, just like the man himself. In traditional tomb architecture, the deceased ends his nocturnal journey in the east, so he can accompany the rising sun every day. Whereas here, Padiamenope dug a passageway which ends with a false door open to the north. Why this anomaly?
This is the west and this is the east, and logically all of the texts end in the east. So why this turn to the north? There's a false door which would open to the north, for the deceased to leave northwards. When you study the plan of the tomb, there are no obstacles to prevent the passage going east. So there's no architectural or material reason for this. In fact, the answer is above our heads, just here, with a formula taken from the pyramid texts. Just before the crack on the second line are the names of what the Egyptians called the indestructibles, the circumpolar stars always seen in the northern sky.
With this hieroglyphic spell, Padiamenope wanted to join the stars that always shone in the sky, whatever the season.
We can see his wish to have two possibilities of guaranteeing life after death. Plus, we witness his knowledge of the most ancient texts. And it's incredible how he managed to incorporate his deep knowledge of ancient texts into the architecture.
Padiamenope thus ensured he had two exits into the afterlife. But study of the third part of the tomb, that which Professor Troniquer calls the private part, reserves still other surprises. We must descend the infamous shaft of room 12, the one that terrified visitors and earned the tomb the legend of being cursed. Then we must follow the passageway to room 19.
Here's the famous scene, Awakening Osiris, which must have covered the entire wall. The central part features the god Osiris. Before him is his son Horus, who is holding the symbol of life under his father's nose. The hieroglyphs say, waking up. Osiris is usually combined with another scene featuring two sunboats, with the sun god Ra-Horati, and on several registers, a whole series of deities or genies.
A second shaft descends even further into a strange room which resembles a sarcophagus of the Old Kingdom. Technically, it's the last room in the tomb. Any pillagers entering here could go no further. Beyond here, there is nothing. But it's a decoy. In fact, the real burial chamber is above. You have to smash the ceiling to discover Padiamenope's true burial chamber. And when you do enter, it's a revelation. The decoration on the walls and ceiling of the chamber are worthy of the Sistine Chapel. With the help of Egyptologists, they have been virtually restored to their original state.
Padiamenope clearly wanted to conceal the entrance to this last room where he was probably buried. But as we found no remains of a sarcophagus, the latest hypothesis to be put forward is that his mummy was inside a wooden coffin placed on a funerary bed, possibly in the central part of the room. This hypothesis is based on the fact that on the east and west walls of this chamber, between the niches which must have held statuettes, there are images of guardian genies, deities, who were supposed to protect Padiamenope's body. The same guardian genies that featured to the left and right of Awakening Osiris. So the hypothesis is that Padiamenope wanted to reproduce a kind of three-dimensional Awakening Osiris, in which Padiamenope, on his funerary bed and surrounded by guardian genies, takes the place of Osiris.
The final veil over the enigma of Padiamenope has been lifted. Associating himself with a judge of the dead and receiving his blessing and good grace was undoubtedly the best guarantee of living eternally in the afterlife. Exploration of his tomb has revealed an extraordinary figure, a priest a scribe, and a scholar who played a crucial role at the Pharaoh's court. Despite the 2,500 years that separate them, Padiamenope and Champollion shared the same universalist ambition of embracing an entire knowledge and an entire culture. In hindsight, one seems to place himself in the continuity of the other.
Both of them wanted to pass on something they possessed. Padiamenope wanted to pass on his knowledge of history, a much older history of his civilization. And Champollion wanted to discover and then pass on to his contemporaries all of those wonderful things he had discovered.
Shortly after returning from his voyage to Egypt, Champollion fell ill. He died in Paris on March 4, 1832, aged 41. Despite his early passing, he left behind a vast body of work.
By cracking the code of hieroglyphs, Champollion opened the great door to what would become Egyptology, which is still developing today and destined to know even greater developments.
Today's Egyptologists have taken up the baton from the great decipherer. The priority on their next campaigns will be to continue conserving the tomb and restoring its treasure in order to reveal the last secrets of Padiamenope. Whether it's inside the tomb or through the countless texts left by the scribes of Deir el-Medina, they will discover more about the everyday lives of these distant ancestors. Our wonderment is yet to be fully satisfied. There is still so much to learn about this fabulous civilization.